Internets, welcome back to another episode of Sultans and Sneakers. I'm your host, as always, Maheen the podcaster, and on today's show, I've got Estela Rodriguez-Jebril, who is the founder of the Passionate Muslima Academy and the host for Let's Talk About Sex on British Muslim TV. She helps busy women get fully aligned with their feminine sensual energy so they step into their leadership potential with confidence and avoid living in the past. Um, it's almost like Estela, first of all, thank you for coming on the show and thank you for reaching out to me. And I was telling you off the record that it was a I almost deleted your message because it seemed the subject matter seemed like one of those spam messages of people trying to get on random podcasts, but you were like a real person with an actual like legit like pitch for the show. So first of all, thanks for coming on and appreciate you reaching out.
Well, thank you for opening the email. I'm glad you didn't delete it. So right. I'm really, really honored to be here and really, really honored to be connecting with you. This is really a privilege.
And I think, and we'll get into the meat of the matter. I think people can look forward to a conversation because you are essentially, you kind of serve as a coach for women in the Muslim community, right? Or do you also coach non-Muslims?
I coach non-Muslims as well. Okay. I'm a licensed therapist. I'm a coach, and I primarily focus on Muslim women, but I do work with non-Muslim women, non-Muslim couples as well.
Sure. And is it is it safe? Is it politically correct to call you a sex coach, or what's the?
I am a sex coach. Yes, I am a sex coach.
You're a sex coach. Okay, so cool. So I want to start this conversation off. I remember I want to go back maybe 15, 16 years now. I grew up in Ohio, but those people who know me know that I lived a few years in Toronto, Canada. I spent the first couple of years of my undergraduate there, and when I went back to visit, and I ran into an old friend of mine. He was of a Christian background, and at the time, I just got into Islam like real hard, and I was proselytizing to him. Right, I was kind of telling him why Islam is the truth, and he should think about becoming Muslim, and what it's done for me in the last few years since we had parted ways. And so he tells me something interesting. He's like, you know what? I understand you guys have a concept of like hurul ain, or having partners in paradise, like sexual partners in paradise, right?
Right.
And he's like, I can't understand. And to me, I can't accept that because for me as a Christian, like sin is inherently sinful. I mean, sex is inherently sinful, right? Mm-hmm. And I was like, really? Okay, well. And I hadn't heard that before, but my friend was from Africa, Sierra Leone. So it may have something to do with maybe the practice of the Eastern Orthodox Church there. But I wanted to get your take as someone who grew up Catholic, is now Muslim. Can you share some insights on maybe the varying degrees of how sexuality or sex is approached in various faith communities?
In the Christian faith, in the Catholic faith, it is looked at as a sinful act. And, from a very young age, you are really indoctrinated into believing that sex is inherently dirty. It's sinful. And which is really a huge contradiction to the fact that as, people of faith, it's very important to get married, right? I grew up in a conservative Catholic family that wasn't always practicing, but, was conservative. And the goal was always, to grow up, get married, have a family. So there was always confusion. There was always confusion and understanding, well, if, how can we live a full life if, sex is such a dirty, evil thing? Everyone's talking about sex. Everyone's thinking about sex. I mean, I remember being 13 years old in middle school and everyone's talking about sex. Did you have sex? Did you have sex? And I grew up in a Catholic community where everyone was going to church on Sunday. So there is this inherently evil perception of sex.
Interesting. Now you're talking about when you were in high school. I don't want to dig you here, but I'm guessing that was like the 80s.
I graduated in 1980. Yes. So I
Okay.
was in middle school in the
Mm.
70s, right? I was in middle school in the 70s. Yeah.
So you think America would have been more conservative, because it seems like America becomes more liberal as the time, like, I talk to kids now who are in high school, and the stuff that they're telling me about is like, I graduated high school in 1999.
Mhm.
So, it's like a world apart. So I would have thought that maybe in the 70s or in the late 70s, there still would have been some kind of stigma around, in the general, people wouldn't be so open about sex. But then again, you also had the sexual revolution of the 60s, right?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
yes. So, there was a lot of exploration. Yes, it was still very much hush hush.
Mm-hmm.
It was still very much something that was hidden. It was still something that you did, hoping that nobody knew, nobody, found out and started gossiping about it. But it was still a part of conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember specifically it was in seventh grade that I started hearing that my girlfriends were having sex, and
Seventh grade.
seventh grade.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's when my confusion started, because, it was, I came from a very conservative family and we didn't talk about sex. One of the interesting things about my story is that, menstruation is something that happens to us females, right? And in my household, my mom, never talked about what happens, when you go through puberty. So when that happened to me, I was just like shocked. I'd never, you have the sex education in school, but it's so just sterile. Like, you don't really pay attention to it. It's like confusing. And in my household, it was such a taboo topic that, first of all, I was scared to tell my mom, I'm bleeding. What do I do? But I noticed that she had some things in the bathroom. So literally for a full year, I was, taking care of myself during that time of the month, but never speaking to my mom about it and never talking about it. And she somehow just pretended like it wasn't happening, even though it was happening.
Right. Now, what's your ethnic background?
I'm Mexican.
Okay. And so is that common within the Mexican culture that the mothers wouldn't necessarily even, you would just like, you would just start, like something would just happen, right? Like I never got, like, for example, like what we call, the technical term is nocturnal emission, but a wet dream. Like my dad never told me this was going to happen,
And
right?
when it happens, you freak out, I would imagine.
Well, you know what you do is you kind of like, you kind of were like trying to be real low key about it.
Like, whoa, what was that?
Well, you're also like, okay, well, I gotta wash this. Let me just tie this up in a bag or something, and then just hide it, and then like I'll wash it at some point. But I'm not gonna throw it into the or I was, you clean it off. I knew it was something I had to do, but it was something. Yeah, you never got education. Occasionally at school, like that's where kids learn, is at school, right? And sometimes it's the worst place to learn because the stuff, you're at the whims and desire. Like some people, then, I mean, I had classmates talking about sex in like fourth or fifth grade, not having sex, but like telling me. So I remember, I'll tell you my first education story. So I have a childhood friend of mine who's friends to this day. I want to say he was in fourth grade or fifth grade, and I would have been in the second or third. So he's a couple years older than me, but we're both Bangladeshi, right? Mm-hmm. So he's trying to explain to me what happens in sex ed, and he was like, "Hey, he pulls me aside. Hey, like, you want to learn what I'm learning in like sex ed?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. Like, why not?" I'm third grade, and he's like, you know what happens when like you like see a girl you like and you're like your penis gets hard?" And I'm like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." I don't know what you're talking about. I'm in third grade, right? And then he like tells me like, "Okay, well, that happens sometimes." And he tells me about some girl in this class he liked in fifth grade. And then he was like, "Oh, do you know like so and so Christy?" I remember her name was some girl named Christy. He's like, "Yeah. So if a guy likes her, she can get pregnant." I was like, "Oh, really?" That's all he told me.
And that's how the stories start, right?
Yeah.
That's how the stories start. Mm-hmm. And from the perspective of a girl,
right?
If a boy holds your hand, if a boy touches you, you can get pregnant, right? You can get pregnant. And And once you start your period, then you better watch out because, that's when you're really going to be, it can happen just by looking at someone, right? So you get all this confusion in your mind.
Mm-hmm.
And when you start, having that attraction to the opposite sex, which is normal and natural. I remember when I was in third grade, I had this crush. Like I was the Mexican girl that immigrated and didn't speak any English at all. Like I started first grade, no English, second grade, no English. They didn't have English as second language when I was, when I immigrated. Third grade, I remember that the only thing that, and then I was really scared in school because I didn't understand anything. And I remember in third grade, the only thing that calmed me down was this crush that I had on this blue-eyed, blonde-haired boy that was just so cute. And I remember just feeling so soothed because, I would look at him and my heart would race and I would just feel this like ecstatic feeling. And I remember that so clearly, that third grade, fourth grade, fifth, that was when elementary school ended at sixth grade. All through elementary school, I had this crush on this boy because I felt this sense of comfort within me. I didn't understand it, of course. I didn't understand it at all, but it's that feeling that we get when we get this almost orgasmic feeling, right? That nobody ever talks about. Nobody ever, nobody ever expresses what it is, but that's when experimentation starts because of the confusion.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like what they call the butterflies or puppy love.
Yeah.
Yeah. People, because like, it's almost like when you walk by the girl in the hallway and like the one you like, and your like stomach just turns, you like, you actually freeze up. You actually like, let me like, and you see if you can take a detour somewhere else. In a way, or you know what I'm talking about? Yeah.
Maybe that's the reaction for the male, but for the girl, it's like you're elated. You're elated.
Okay. I mean, but other thing is, I bet in third grade, so girls would say that to me in like elementary school, like I like you, and I'm like, what do you talk like? And I really maybe looking back is like because girls mature earlier than guys. So if you're a third grader, I'm assuming this guy wasn't even looking at. He probably thought girls had cuties.
Yes.
Right. Probably until like sixth grade. All of a sudden, there's like a switch that happens between like fourth and fifth or fifth and sixth. Because in fifth grade, they started talking about it. In sixth grade, it was like expected, right? That you were going to be dating. I think that's the expectation in middle school. I think that's why the transition from elementary to middle school is so difficult for kids.
Yes, absolutely. And that's when a lot of the insecurities come up, right? And if you have no clear understanding of what's going on, like I have 3 kids myself. My kids are all adults now.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I told myself, because I did have so much confusion about sexuality all through my teenage years, in my early 20s, I got married really young because I felt like I actually had to, like, because I did grow up in a conservative family. Like if you are doing things outside of marriage, you're cursed, like you're evil, like you're going to end up in hellfire. Right. So it's this fear that you also grow up with because there's no context to like how to really navigate through it. So one thing that I did because of this experience is like really educate my kids to feel comfortable about their own anatomy, about, touching themselves and not feeling that it was dirty, and knowing that they could communicate, with me, with their dad. My husband was also really open. I have 2 daughters and 1 son. Of course, I could speak, as my son got older, he felt more comfortable talking to his father. But as a family, it was something that I was really just aware of and cognizant that this is something that has to change. And it really empowered my kids to make better decisions for themselves. Like they still went through all those conversations, but the conversations they had with me always blew me away because it was like, oh my gosh, if I ever had that conversation with my parents, they probably would have freaked out. Mom, I like this, I'm having feelings for a boy. I'm having feelings for a girl. And then the whole other perspective of Islam, right? When I became a Muslim, I found it so fascinating, actually, because I started reading books that gave me the impression of really the openness of the faith, And yes, Islam is absolutely a guide for us if we don't, put our own twisted, interpretations into it, right?
Right.
So as I started to become more familiar with the community of Muslims, right?
Yep.
The rigidity about sex and sexuality was shocking to me. And I was actually once again like really confused, like how do I navigate through a community that I want to be a part of when there's still this taboo about sex and sexuality? And it's so clear that there's so much abuse at many levels that goes on. And that's really the core essence of me wanting to be so open with my kids, is to be preventive. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I think that I've heard that people say this, and it makes sense, that Islam is a sex positive religion.
It really is.
You know what I'm saying? Because of, you look at some of the texts, you look at the works of Ibn Hazm, the Ring of the Dove, like, there's that passionate part, but then there's also Imam Suyuti. I remember a friend of mine told me it's like a decade ago that he has a text that has like a commentary on like all these various positions, right? That you never hear about. I mean, we all have, but again, from a South Asian point of view, there's zero conversations with our parents about like what's going to happen. I mean, we learned it from the movies, to be honest. I mean, like,
which is the most dangerous thing,
right,
for human beings, right?
Yeah.
To have these expectations of just something that is so false, right?
Right. And I think because, so it's the other, to tie into this, not to digress, but I think that similarly to Catholicism, in Islam, sex outside of marriage is considered a sin, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, actually, it seems like Catholicism, sex period is considered a sin. Sex outside of marriage is a bigger sin.
Sex period is considered like you get married, but don't enjoy it, right? You should have sex just for procreation. This is what really Christianity and but when you get into the text, it's also different. When you get into the biblical text and the theological text, it's that distortion that man puts into, the actual revelation, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's where I think it comes with. And then what happens is that, like, so a lot of my friends who veered off from practicing Islam, I think they broke because sex was considered to be like the worst thing you could do. Right. Yeah. So once they went down that rabbit hole, they were like, well, they just checked out of the religion. Because they were like, well,
I'm done.
Yeah, I'm done, right? And that's the thing. It kind of was like, and the thing of it is, I don't know how people make it. I somehow, I almost feel, I always say, like, I think my mom made a lot of dua for me, prayers for me when she was pregnant or something, because like I randomly just avoided situations. Like, I've had friends go that route, and when I ask them how they got there, and it's very like you don't put yourself, you just end up in the situations, and what are you gonna do? And I just never end up in those situations. Maybe I don't think I would have probably made the same decisions as them had I,
you were
been there.
SubhanAllah, you were protected.
Right.
It's true. I'll give you a story about myself.
Sure.
I had this friend, and she was my best friend all through middle school.
Yeah.
And she was really promiscuous.
Okay.
And I always felt like, what's wrong with me? Like, what's wrong with me? I did everything possible to try to get with a boy.
Yep.
I thought that's what I had to do. And it is, and this is where there is proof in prayer. Absolutely. I went camping with her on this one summer because her family knew my family. They trusted him, so they let me go. On this camping trip, she meets a guy, and this guy has a friend, and they're going off, doing their thing. It was at the beach.
Yep.
So I went off with this boy, and I was like, oh, this is my chance. This is my chance. My ignorant mind, but subhanallah, this young man, I was 15 at the time, and he had to have been 17 or 18. And he looked at me and he said, this is not the way it's supposed to be. Mm-hmm. Like, he had this true compassion for me. So I can understand what you're saying. And there were a variety of other scenarios until I became, later in my teens, I realized, oh my gosh, I could have easily been in these situations where I was taken advantage of. I was abused because of my own distortion of thinking that my friend is having sex and somehow I'm not. So that means there's something wrong with me. So I'm sharing that with you because in the story, that people sometimes, compare themselves to, their peers. Of course, there's that comparison that creates that distortion. And for us as Muslims, absolutely, we know shaitan is going to be there whispering, right? And we really, even with our families, I work with a lot of families who have no understanding why their kids become rebellious, why their kids, are rude and disrespectful to them. And it's that aspect of they didn't build, a connection with their children, and then they allowed, for that whisper of shaitan to come in and take over. And it's because of the lack of, their own level of responsibility as a parent,
Right. Yeah. And so for the non-Muslim listeners, if anyone tuning in, shaitan is just indicating the devil or Lucifer or whatever he goes by these days. I think Lucifer has a show now on FX.
I see that and I'm like curious and I want to watch it. And then I'm like, my brain is, prime real estate. I don't need this.
Right. Exactly. So now, how did you get into this line of work of, like, I guess, becoming a sex coach? Like, how did that happen?
What really happened is, I was working initially as a therapist, predominantly with women, because I was working in the school district when I was first a therapist, and I was working with the students, and most of the students were in single parent families with a single mom, with single moms, and these were predominantly non-Muslim women. But I predominantly would always work with the women because, they were the biggest influencers with their children. And, the school wanted the children to do their homework, behave in the classroom. So I worked with women predominantly, single women, single moms, and with multiple children, and the more that I engaged with them and built trust with them, the key factor for all of the women was their inability to really see their own value as women, and they allowed them, they would fall into this trap of believing that the only thing that gave them value was being with a man and being able to have sex with a man.
Okay.
And that was for me just a moment where, it just made me really dig deep into, like, how can I help these women really understand their own value, their own sexuality, that they're a separate, and, a relationship is, one of the most, one of the most just precious things in life when you meet your life partner. But to believe that the only way to accomplish that is by having sex, giving yourself up to someone, it's just so devaluing, right? So devaluing. So from the very onset of doing the work that I was doing, predominantly to work with children, I started working with these single women who had multiple children with multiple men that would abandon them. And then the women would feel worthless and they would feel disempowered. And, they would, fall into the trap of, being a part of the system, right? Either losing their kids or becoming drug addicts, and it was just this vicious cycle that always circled back to their understanding or their misunderstanding of their own potential and it being connected to their sexuality and their sensuality.
Now, how old were you when you started this kind of work then? I get.
Well, I was in my late 30s. I was in my late 30s when I started this work. Yes.
Yeah. And so were these married women or women who just had boyfriends or single women? Like what's their demographic?
Some of them were married and divorced. Some of them were never married, and it had just multiple partners. And what was really interesting for me, and I was Muslim at the time, but I was predominantly working with a non-Muslim population. But as I started to do my work, my children started getting to the age where, I wanted them to be a part of the Muslim community. Like my family isn't Muslim.
Sure.
And my husband's family is Muslim, but they mainly lived overseas. So it was, I wanted to really make an effort to get them connected with, the Muslim community so they could have that foundation for themselves.
Sure.
And as I did that, I began to recognize that so many similar things were happening with women that were Muslim. They were married, they had children, but they were in dysfunctional marriages.
Right. Yeah. So I guess like so to me, I was telling you earlier that I have explored, like, you essentially start off with as a therapist, right? And then you kind of specialize in this niche of like helping women with their sexuality, right?
Yes.
So I've explored that personally, and then from the man's side of things, right? And so when I hear men like gripe about like sex or not having enough, because for the perception of men is that men just want sex. I think women understand that as well, like theoretically speaking, right? Because they say the whole idea of men are pigs, all men are pigs.
All they want to do is sleep with you.
Well, we are, like, biologically speaking, like, yeah. I mean, I remember I was having a very
it is a stage that everyone goes through where you're like very much have heightened sexuality, right?
Right.
There's ups and downs with
the
libido.
Yeah, libido, right. I'm not, my wife and I were both in our 30s, and she tells me that women's libido goes nuts in their 40s, right? I don't know if that's
the older we get, it improves, believe it or not.
Which is weird because for guys, it's like, when you're, it's like teenagers, and then, so I also curious, how do you think that works with that dynamic? Because typically we're with our spouses of a similar age, and there's it seems to be an imbalance there. Like when the men
see, sex is not all about penetration.
Right.
There are different aspects of intimacy that nobody really, very few people explore. Very few people explore, right? So when you have the view that sex is only about penetration and the libido starts changing, then there's this disconnect that happens with the couple. Absolutely.
Right. Okay. So what falls in, because one thing I hear about a lot is that from the guy's point of view, is that their wives just aren't into them anymore, right? They lose the attraction factor, or they have, I think men a lot of times, there's a guy named Pat Stedman who is like, does a lot of work with helping men establish like their sexual power, etc. I wouldn't call him a therapist, so to speak, but he talks about this thing called frame control. Right, that the man establishes frame as a leadership quality, and if you and that's something that essentially will make himself more attractive to his wife or his girlfriend, right? It's is that he lost control of frame. He's letting whatever fly. It's not even necessarily physical. It's just how he carries himself. If that makes sense.
And that happens on both sides.
Okay.
For women, what is, the dynamics of what actually pulls her away from her spouse is the concept of control. As women, we're very controlling. We because it makes us feel safe. One of the interesting things is that we think if we control our spouse, if we control our husband, that everything's going to be fine. If we tell them what to do, if we tell them how to behave, if we, unfortunately, the mindset of the women many times when they go into a marriage is that the man is broken. The man has problems. But who doesn't have problems? Who doesn't have flaws? Everybody has flaws. But unfortunately, for women, that control comes from a place of perfectionism.
Okay.
If we're not at our top, in our physical aspects, the way we dress, the way, our belongings, our things, then somehow we feel like we're losing control, right? So there's this control aspect that women, which is the reason why women clash with men. There has to be this ability for us women to create a safe space for a man to be vulnerable. One of the things that is really interesting is that, that leadership that you talk about, for a man to step into his leadership, he has to feel that it's safe to be vulnerable. And a woman in a marriage, it's the woman who creates that space for her man.
Mm-hmm.
And it does work both ways. And a lot of women have a really hard time because they feel like, why do I have to do the work? Why do I have to be the one that creates the safe space? And the reason that we need to do the work is because we want that harmony.
Right. But don't you think, because I think when you have a woman who wants to control everything, right, and is like, tell their husband to do this, I need this and this, it's like directive. Like, I've heard sisters or women complain that they've just become another mom and they don't want to be their husband's mom.
And that's what creates the disconnect, because who wants to have sex with their mom?
Right.
And what woman wants to have sex with her son? If she's treating her husband like her son, right? Like, I'm your mother. You have to do as I say, or, so there's this unfortunate, view that has to change, this perception that has to change.
Mm-hmm.
And, first of all, you have to be able to be aware of it. It takes awareness. You have to become aware of it first and foremost. And a large population, a large number, I would say, over 80% of couples, men and women, just don't have that awareness.
Okay, so a couple minutes ago, you said that the root cause, like the root of their desire for control, is the desire for safety and security, right? If they don't have control, then they feel like they don't feel safe. Now, that's going back to the whole thing of like man establishing frame and leadership. If the woman is confident in her husband's giving her that safety or security, then she doesn't necessarily then she's like, okay, he's got this.
Yes.
Right?
Ooh, that's such a powerful statement right there. Because when a man hears that, what does he do? He elevates in his leadership.
Right, exactly, right? And so therefore, but what happens when he's getting talked down to, it was funny because, the communication, I was talking to one of my coworkers at work today. He's about almost 20 years older than me. So he's got a lot more experience in marriage. We're just talking about like, how we do chores at home and how stuff gets assigned to us, right? like literally I'll get like I'm like, for me it's only when people are coming over I will like literally I'm actually gonna quote this. I'm gonna find, because I was sure, you know, I'll just get a text message out of the blue. So let's say today's Wednesday. Let's say if we were having people over on Saturday, this is kind of what I was looking at, and I'll keep talking to you while I find this message. That's really funny, but it's also like when you get it, you're like, it's almost like you feel like it, and I know it's not meant to be like disrespectful, but you're kind of like,
but it is.
yeah, right. And I think that's where, and if you ask, like, if you got upset about it, the reaction would be like, why are you upset? Like, I'm just, this is what needs to get done before thing. Okay, so here's the thing. So I'll take this. So back in July, my parents were coming to town. They come to, for the 4th of July. So I get a text message out of the blue. Sometimes at like 2 in the morning, by the way. Like I'll wake up and I'll be like 2 in the morning, get this text message saying, tasks for Friday. Number 1, finish cleaning bathroom, shower, floor. Put away stuff on the counter. Number 2, clean guest room. Number 3, change sheets in guest room. Number 4, vacuum guest room. Number 5, clean kitchen counter. 6, clean upstairs hallway. Obviously these things have to get done, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's specified like task for Saturday, task for Sunday. Because if we have, depending on when people are coming over, and she knows the scope of the work, right? For my parents, it's gonna be less. It's gonna be more loose. I'm like, yo, let it go. Like, it's not that big of a deal, right? They're always come. They're gonna come when they come. But I think the initial reaction, and to me, I know that my wife isn't like trying to be like insulting or disrespectful, but my natural reaction when I first get the text is like almost like a red alert, like a red alarm goes off. Like you feel kind of shook for a second, like what the hell was that?
And that's that imbalance and that disrespect that, like you said, is not intentional, but that's how it's perceived, right?
Right.
And most of the time what happens, it gets brushed off.
Right.
It doesn't get addressed.
Mm-hmm.
But it never disappears, and it just builds and builds and builds. You build resentment, she builds resentment. For a while, I mean, I've been married for 32 years. And in the 32 years I've been married, I filed for divorce 4 times.
On the same within the 32 year with the same
I'm not
husband.
Proud of that.
Yeah.
I'm not proud of that.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
And but it was sometimes it takes something drastic to create the change that you're really wanting to happen in your marriage. And I'm not suggesting that I'm not suggesting that women do this. I'm just sharing that, this is because as women, when we feel like we're losing control. So let's say, I had similar traits. I had similar traits where I was like a sergeant, and I used to like really feel like, oh, this is what keeps, things moving. This is what keeps things moving. But what I noticed is the more demanding I became, or the more rigid I became, the farther and farther apart my husband and I, became. Like,
right.
We just, and the reason I'm sharing that is because as women, we have to be willing to pay attention to our style of communication and how it impacts. Now, most of the time what happens is that it doesn't get discussed and it doesn't get communicated. And then there's an outburst of some type that, is the outcome of that has nothing to do with even, that conversation that could have been had, or that, that task that was assigned. And the reason that I'm sharing this too is because it's so important to be able to recognize when you need support, when you need help. Most people wait until they're over the edge, over the cliff, right? And that's what I would do in my own marriage, is I would wait until things were to the point of almost no return. This is over. And I really commend my husband for having so much patience with me, because those were the times where he didn't give up on me. And I'm so grateful that he didn't, because then I was able to come back and say, wait a minute, what is it that I'm not willing to look at within myself.
Right, right. And so let me ask you this. So then, because when I hear when people file for divorce, in their mind they're already checked out, like they feel like they're divorced, right? And you went through it 4 times. Like, what is the mindset like when you is it something that's built up? Is it where you have something built up over time and then something snaps and then you're like, I've had enough, I'm out, I want to you divorce?
And of course, I'm not talking about situations where there is
Like
physical
abuse,
abuse,
yeah,
or sexual abuse, or any type of abuse,
or infidelity,
or infidelity.
right?
I'm talking about a relationship where the frustration gets so high that you have zero regard for the other person, and it's always about communication. And yes, you completely check out, and it's always an internal thing. It always has to do, like, those were my insecurities. They really had nothing to do with my husband, but I was perceiving everything that he brought as a threat because of the insecurities that I had within myself.
Sure, sure. Okay. So I want to get your take on this. So we talk about, so it's, I think we've established the fact that for men, sex is about physical. We haven't, but it's like we've kind of talked. But for women, it's like emotional. There's a lot of, everything has to be lined. Like if the, like for a guy, the bathroom could be a disaster, right? But for a woman, if the bathroom's a disaster, there's like, she's worried about the cleanup after. That's in her head. That's not gonna make it enjoyable for her. Am I right?
Yeah, the scene has to be set. The scene has to be set. Yeah.
And I think that's where the discrepancy is, because what happens is we get so busy. How do you advise couples to just like slow down? Because these days it's almost like, I mean, people say, I thought that some people, they're like, well, the woman, if her job is taking away from her husband, then she needs to like focus on her husband and like leave her job. And I'm like, well, listen, man, we the economy today, like sometimes both people got to work, right? And you're in a situation where you just can't, like, one person just can't give up the job. Or in my case, for example, my wife makes more money than me, so like I don't want her leaving her job.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes. So you have to find that balance, right?
Yeah.
You have to find that balance, and you have to be willing to take inventory of what's really going on. Yes. There are, jobs that just take so much time, so much dedication, and that, both men and women are passionate about. But there has to be this level of flexibility. What's so important to be able to do is take that inventory of, like, what is it that I really need? What is it that I really need? And why am I afraid to ask for it? And most of the time we just keep going and going and going and going before we even start asking those questions. And then the burnout happens and the overwhelm happens, right? And there just has to be that that moment where you can pause and that the world's not going to fall apart. I mean, if COVID showed us anything, is that everything can stop.
Yep.
We're actually going to become more creative, more innovative, and look at how things are moving forward now, right?
Right.
I mean, it's one of the things that is so fascinating is just the things that are being done because of technology, right?
Sure.
So you have to be willing to hold each other accountable, and you have to be willing to hold yourself accountable. One of the things that when I had my, usually women really begin to experience burnout and overwhelm when children come, when we start having a family, because that, and a variety of things can happen, emotionally as well as physically. But especially here in the United States, we're in the United States, right? In Western countries, and I think, in places like the UK probably have even more resources set up. One of the things that I learned actually from one of my supervisors when I was working at a nonprofit is that, that we can take, leave, we can take time off, we can actually pause. And so many times we're just so caught up into in the belief of, if I don't keep, going full bore, somehow, I'm not successful. Somehow, that's a definition of me, like not doing the best that I can, right? So it's so important to give ourselves permission. It's so important to give each other permission. It's so important to be able to say, hey, let's take, one of the practices that I suggest that all couples do before you even have families, because once you have families, if you haven't established this, it's going to be really hard to establish it. But to have something that's called town hall meetings with the couples that I work with. And most of the times I work with couples that, they're both successful. The husband is working, the wife is working, they're both, have something that they're passionate about and they're investing their time and energy in, right? So
Sure.
Coming back to, each other, sometimes, you're exhausted, you're depleted. And one of the things that I always recommend to couples is to have what is called town hall meetings, to have one day out of the week for 1 hour where you sit and you just check in with each other. You check in with each other. Where are you at emotionally? What have you been experiencing? What have you experienced with me that you haven't shared? What are you experiencing at work that you haven't shared with me? What are the ideas that, we have for, things that we want to do together? There has to be this actual intentional pause that is so hard for us to do.
Yeah. And can it be like over a date night, or does it have to be like something
separate? Date night, you should have date nights, yes, but it's a separate thing, because a date night is where you're going to get, dressed up and go out on a lovely dinner, or you're going to get, in the car and go for a drive, or you're going to make a nice romantic dinner at home and just spend time together, or you're going to sit on the couch and watch a movie, and enjoy it together. So date night is very different. Date night is very different.
Okay. Now, I think I think you hit a nail on the head there as far as like established before kids, because when you have kids, the practice is the kids become the priority, right? And so everything becomes about the kids, and then you have like, there's no such thing as dad guilt, I don't think, but there's mom guilt.
A lot of mom guilt, lot of mom guilt, and then it's dad's fault.
Right.
Then your marriage really is going to suffer, so you have to establish this first year of marriage, so that it evolves and it becomes this consistent practice. I mean, it takes 10,000 hours to master any skill.
Yeah.
So if you're going to master skill in your marriage, it's going to take, consistency, and it's going to take intention, right?
Sure. Yeah. I think we go through. So I think what happens is this is the common, I've been married now for 12 years. So a lot of my friends, similar time, 10, 15 years, and I know the thing of it is that when you're in this honeymoon phase, you're not even arguing, like you're having sex all the time, right? It's almost, and then I remember when I got married, like 2009, right? One of the guys at work was like, "You just got married?" He's like, "Yeah, I remember those days." He's like, "It'll last about a year." He told me, and I was like,
well, "It's because it is that infatuation time." See, the thing that we have to, it actually has a name. It's called limerence.
Okay.
Limerence, and what it is, it's this time of infatuation. You don't see the flaws in each other. You have that attraction, that heightened attraction. And
right.
That is, and if a marriage starts out that way, that is what you want to use as your baseline to create that limerence, because limerence is something that you have to continuously work to cultivate over and over in your marriage.
Okay, so it seems like you just assume that is what it is. 'Cause I remember we had you familiar with Sheikh Yasser Burgess's Love Notes class,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Right. I remember I took that when I was single. I think I took it once when I was married, like newly married, right? But again, when you take it when you're single, like, oh, this is easy, like because you're naturally thinking that you're gonna be in love, and it'll just. And when you first get married, I remember one guy asked me, and I was telling some guys this last night, that because we were talking about like all the challenges our wives give us. We were, and he was like, and I was like, I remember the first year of marriage, somebody asked me, and I was like, I don't even notice other women. I mean, when I first got married, like I remember that phase, and obviously that's not the case anymore. But just to be truthful about it, but I think that's like I think that's where the failure is when we talk about when we get into like counseling or premarital counseling. Um, that isn't real. Like I don't remember that being really talked about. I think my wife and I had like one session of premarital counseling over the phone, not even in person, and because we
Should
were
be a
living.
prerequisite. It should
Yeah,
be, you know how families come together. Now, in the Mexican culture,
yeah,
it's not so extravagant, the whole marriage thing. And my husband got lucky because he married me,
yeah,
before I became Muslim. So he didn't have to go through the whole ordeal.
right,
We have, two daughters, so they kind of, experienced it, but not to the extreme because it could be so convoluted, right? Just like
sure,
the celebration and, how you're going, a lot of showing off, right? That's how
yeah,
I say it's a lot of showing off. There's so much investment in that. I mean, the Western is like the investment in, the partying and all that. There's always an investment that's put in the wrong place.
right,
The investment needs to be put in that knowledge, that growing the knowledge base of what is a marriage? What do let's talk about sex. That's when you want to be talking about sex. What are your questions? You're attracted to each other, of course, it's uncomfortable, but with a professional that can help cultivate the conversation,
yeah.
really be insightful.
I
And
remember because I remember when that question popped up on the call. I just heard dead silence, and then there's this perception that if the guy brings it up, he's perceived as a pervert. And I think that's, and I actually asked on the, I host a podcast, co-host a podcast called the Mad Mamluks, right? Another that I've been hosting for a long time, and we had a someone who does like therapy work and premarital counseling, and I remember asked her, and I was on a show with all women. I was the only guy on this particular episode, and I was like, why don't we hear anything about like premarital sex counseling, right? And she was like, well, what would that look like? I'm like, and from a guy, it's more like how often, like you would think that it's like, because what do guys complain about? Lack of frequency and lack of passion, right?
yes,
Like either they're not getting it, or if they are, it's like their spouse is just doing it because it's so unquote just fulfilling her
doing her
whatever.
duty. And what do women complain about? There's not enough romance, or there's not enough, there's not enough intrigue in it, right? Like she's not being lured into it. So what do you talk about? What does premarital sex look like? Premarital sex counseling look like?
Right,
What it is really is at the emotional level. What are your interests? What excites you? What turns you on? A turn on is not just about a man getting an erection and a woman getting ready to be penetrated.
right,
That's not all that is, connected to, and what it will do is it will create a deeper exploration of what your true sensory, details are when it comes to what does excite you.
right.
So there are so many different levels at the sensory level, at the needs level. Like what is it that, and to be able to talk about explicitly with somebody that you've already gotten engaged to in, a safe space with somebody that can guide you.
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's in a way, if you actually think about it, somehow how we do it, it often seems a little I don't know how to say it, convoluted in a way, because you could be on a call with somebody, um like a premarital call, and that topic comes up, and there's like it's awkwardness and shyness, and then like if you were a good Muslim boy or girl, you didn't even kiss anybody before you were married, so your wedding night you're not expected to go all the way, right? And
Right.
you're like you don't even like because I'm interested to get your take on this, because in the like in the more in a in a less religious household, the kids would be dating in middle school, the first base, second base, third base. That's gradual, right? You kind of feel each base out, so to speak. Whereas with like a lot of Muslim couples, it's like going for the home run on day one or day two, right?
Yeah, yeah. How can that even be, right? How can that even be? So there has to be stages of communication. There has to be stages of, inquiring about the topic,
Mm,
in a healthy way that doesn't have to be dirty or
right.
explicit.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, what are your thoughts on like people have you experienced like symptoms where when you're coaching a couple or you're coaching a woman that they are just the I think prude is the word, but they're just not interested in trying anything out of the ordinary, or they're just like in general they're just not interested, or some guys might even say their wives might be like asexual. um, what do you like? How would you diagnose those kind of situations where it's like just a lack of interest? I would think.
Everyone is different. Everyone
Okay.
is different, and there does need to be I've worked with a lot of women that have experienced a lot of pain, with intimacy, with penetration, and it's the rigidity of the body. It's the inability,
You mean like physical pain,
physical pain. Yeah,
right? Hmm.
pain. And and that is always connected to insecurities.
Mm.
And if a woman is, you know, doesn't have the ability to be playful, doesn't have the ability to, explore, then that really is tied to like her own insecurities, and there needs to be so premarital counseling, premarital sexual counseling is about the couple, and it's about the individuals
Hmm.
bringing to the surface those factors that need to be taken into consideration, you know about the insecurities that they have about themselves.
Right. So I think that it sounds to me, and I think we would agree here, that you almost need to make not only the premarital counseling sessions, not one session, but sessions mandatory, but also some kind of like coaching throughout, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
They say that when if you're in if you're in fitness, right? I recently hired, like people know, recently hired a coach earlier this year, and he really helped me get into the best shape of my life, right? And he tells me he has a coach, and I'm like, now you see the value of coaching, right? um
Absolutely.
you know what I mean, because it's something that like people give you guidance, because otherwise you just feel like you're stuck. What's happening in the community now is, I was having dinner with a friend of mine a few weeks back. He just got divorced,
Mm.
and he was telling me about other friends of his who'd been married 15 years who got divorced. Why? Because they were cheating on their wives because their wives weren't having sex with them,
Mm.
right? Kind of thing, right?
Which
They
is
just weren't.
another topic, because
Yeah, that's another
it's a
problem.
completely different, because
Yeah,
a Muslim man
yeah,
can have four wives.
right.
So, and that's another very, very touchy subject.
Well, and I've heard some people say like you hear all these cases these days about like guys getting secret second wives and stuff, right? Or third, whatever.
Yeah,
I've actually heard from my own mouth people that's recommended things like, well, if your sexual needs aren't being met by your spouse and she's not willing to commit to it, then you should go get a misyar, or some kind of temporary marriage, and you would get it with a non-Muslim girl, because that won't like be as detriment, the impact of the community.
but
And for
why
her,
not do it? Why not do it the way that it's been prescribed? Like,
right,
one thing that that I truly believe that in the US, eventually it's going to be passed that men, there are some amazing couples that are thriving, with, co-wives. There are amazing men that are able, and the day that I heard that same-sex marriages were legal in the United States, I was like, that means that multiple wives is going to be next.
I actually was having this conversation with someone not too long ago, that because and it was about the conversation was about like women being jealous. I'm like, women are going to be jealous, right? But like how so? But like, do you think so? I agree with you. I think there's going to be a time when polygamy will be a cultural norm.
It has to be, because it's part of God's laws.
Right.
When I first became Muslim, and,
right.
And I understood the concept of multiple wives, in the Mexican culture, like Mexican men need to be Muslim, because it's a norm where a man has his wife and then he has his lover. It's like,
and the wife knows about this.
And the wife knows about it. I think all of Mexico will eventually become Muslim. There are a lot of people converting to Islam in Mexico, by the way.
Right.
But it's once again goes back to those insecurities of the woman with her own femininity, when women become aligned with their own femininity, we're not a threat to each other. And what does a woman want except to it goes back to that safety. And yes, and then it gives the woman the ability to really step into her own leadership and create her own success for herself when she has that level of confidence. So I've always looked at this, and my husband always says, you're just trying to get me in trouble, because I would get so annoyed with the jokes that my husband is Palestinian, by the way, he's Arab.
Sure.
And Arabs they're always making these jokes, or, with each other, men, like at your wedding, where they're joking around, and, they, basically saying like, oh, you're gonna get, have a second wife. And then the women would be like, what? And I didn't understand half of what was being said, because I don't speak Arabic and I never picked it up. Mm-hmm. But I always found it like so interesting, because most of the time as women, we can't wait for our husbands to leave.
Right.
And then, when they show an interest in another woman, we get so defensive, like, why are you looking at another woman? What's wrong with me? So it's this just dynamic that becomes so toxic, and it goes so against our faith. And as women, if we could really understand our own sensual needs, our own femininity, and the power that we have, we would be supporting, for our husbands to be at that level where they can love us and love another woman fairly, and equally. Can you imagine the caliber of our men? I've always felt that my husband would have a second wife. He hasn't yet. And every time I bring it up, he's like, oh, you're just trying to get me in trouble. And our divorces were never about other women. When I filed for divorce, it was always about, just our inability to communicate, and me having my own insecurities, So
we talk about communication. Do you think it's, because I hear that the complaint from women that guys don't communicate. Was that your case? Or, because I think it goes both ways. I think it depends on the couple.
It does. It goes both ways. And what we have to learn is the dynamics of how, men are nurtured and women are nurtured. Men are taught to suppress their emotions. So and a big portion of the ones that teach them that our mothers,
Mm-hmm.
be a man, from a very young age. Yes, it is harder. And then for women, we hold ourselves back, or we don't express ourselves, mostly out of resentment, mostly out of bitterness, mostly out of revenge.
Right.
It's always a negative thing. So yes, there's always that factor. There's always that factor of communication. But that's what both are looking for. And it goes back to what you were talking about earlier. Without knowing how to ask for the help, without knowing how to change that generational, inheritance that, hopefully those that listen to this will recognize that within their own family dynamics, they have this huge opportunity just with communication, listening, being able to really be present,
Mm-hmm.
shift everything in a relationship.
Right. The way I look at it is that, so first of all, just to sum up your point, it seems like the demographics, first of all, I think show that there's more women than men, right?
Yes, they do.
Okay. So that's
Across the world, right?
right. So you've got that. You've got like it's a literal it's an imbalance in numbers for monogamy. Okay. But for polygamy to be practiced, then you need the man has to be built up in a way. So we want to help our men embrace masculinity, embrace leadership, and excel in those features, so they can support these multiple women in households.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it does, and a big component of that is how the woman holds her man up,
Right.
how the woman holds her.
Exactly. I was. Do you have you been following some of these Turkish dramas that are on TV, like Ertuğrul and
I
Osman?
love them. I love
Yeah.
them.
Right. So it was really interesting dynamic when I don't know if you watched Kurulus Osman season 2, but he
I haven't found it with the English translation, with the
I'll,
English
I'll send you the link, but he
Well,
actually,
okay.
so he'll send, so basically he marries multiple, he marries a second wife in season 2, because spoiler alert if you haven't watched it, but
It
sorry.
won't spoil it for me. It won't spoil it for me.
Yeah, but I remember there was a certain, like, obviously his first wife was like jealous, right? And the reason he did it, it was like because she was stabbed in the stomach, and they said she couldn't be pregnant, right? And he had to have an heir for the tribe to continue.
Mhm.
So he marries another woman who was the daughter of a bey from another tribe, Malhun Hatun, right? And I was just like, and I saw how her father was just so. It was like, okay, she's never been married before, right? Because in our community, it's like, oh, it's only polygamous if the woman's divorced or a widow, etc., etc. So you've got another woman who's never been married, and the way they portrayed it too, like the husband, like the dad, and they had their own wedding ceremony, and it was nice. Um, and so it's funny because I was a friend of mine. I have 3 girls. My oldest is 8. So I was kind of talking about polygamy with another friend of mine, like just as a theoretical concept that like people, because he was like, "What's going on, man? All these guys are taking secret second wives. These guys are the problem." I'm like, I mean, no, it goes both ways. I mean, polygamy isn't a fix. So what polygamy doesn't work is if your first marriage has gone to hell, polygamy isn't going to fix it.
Exactly.
That's not going to help. So
You got to work on the first one.
yeah.
The first marriage has to be thriving for you to be able to have a successful second marriage.
Correct. Right. So that makes sense, because that's just increase. What you're gonna end up doing is you're gonna have some what was that, limmering or what, honeymoon phase with for a second wife for a little bit, and then you'll have 2 nightmares.
Yes.
Basically,
Yes.
you'll just double the headache. But he asked me, would you be okay with your daughter like being a co-wife? And I'm like, I mean, like, honestly, in a way, I'd feel like kind of honored, because she would be like reviving this practice that, like, for whatever reason, I mean, like, has been stigmatized. And at the end of the day, the way I look at it, if the husband is like in the case of Kurulus Osman, like he becomes the founder of the Ottoman Empire, like his third wife theoretically would be thrilled to be the third one of the wives of Osman Ghazi, right? So
Absolutely.
you know what I'm
I
saying?
mean,
So
just look at our beloved Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him.
absolutely, yeah,
Of
absolutely.
course, they were women and
Yeah,
they had their nature to them.
right.
But how many of them were not raising, who would not raise their hand to be married to our beloved Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him?
Sallallahu
And
alaihi wasallam.
those are the
Yes,
kind of men
absolutely.
that you want.
And I think when women sometimes have a visceral reaction to the idea of polygamy, they're assuming it's just some average Joe Schmo or some guy who's barely getting by who just wants to do it for
Because
having
unfortunately,
some.
that's the toxicity that we see nowadays, right?
Right, you know, and so I think that's where the narrative has, but I think I'm sure you get pushed every time you must bring this up. I'm sure women give you pushback.
Oh, they do.
Yeah.
They do. They do. And the other day, I thought here in my community, it's such a tragic situation. This prominent imam, his wife is divorcing him because of abuse, because he was
Mm.
abusive, and the whole community has turned on her. And when I found out
She's the
about,
one that's abused. She's the one that's been abused, though.
yes,
Okay,
yes,
gotcha.
so she's divorcing him, and I know her, and I kid you not, and I don't want, and I got so emotional because I turned to my husband and I said, I found your second wife. Because she's a woman that would elevate my family,
Hmm.
you know, and it makes me emotional because if we could only see the power of this, this practice for our community. I mean, look at how our ummah is suffering, right? And subhanallah, it makes me really emotional because because it's time that we just wake up. It's time that we just wake up and we recognize that we have so much within our disposal as Muslims in this day and age, and we're letting the dunya dictate the
Hmm.
direction that we go in, and
Right.
and we have no courage. We have no courage to just rise up. Yes, I got very caught up in the magnificent century about Sultan Suleiman, and you see all the betrayal and all that, but a lot of that was done, for ratings,
Sure.
for
Right.
people to watch, right?
Right.
And maybe some aspects of it, um, you know, did happen, but the truth is that we have guidelines, right? We have guidelines to completely allow this to be a practice that brings up generations of youth that know who they are. Most important, like, how many of our youth are so confused right now?
Right.
And it's tragic, and you know I just get bewildered by how so many just get stuck in thinking like, well, what are people going to say,
Right. Right.
so
Exactly.
worried about what the judgments and the criticisms are going to be, instead of truly stepping into living a life that's going to heighten them, and I know it's not for everybody, but when it's presented, especially to a man, you
Yeah.
know when it's presented and it's clear that it's going to elevate you, then do the work emotionally, because it is an emotional, it is an emotional aspect of growth, that if you do the work, we will evolve individually.
Sure. I got two more questions on this topic since we kind of veered off, and it's a nice little tangent here that I think we can wrap up with. But first of all, how often do you find yourself recommending this to us as a solution to either your clients in any way, shape, or form, or um, do you find
I
that most
do.
couple you do?
I do.
You're finding situations where the husband is capable of supporting, and the issues that are present, because the way I've seen it portrayed in a way is that like sometimes the wife could be amazing for all issues, but like she just doesn't like having sex, or it's not her thing, and you know and that gap is not being met, and she's happy, she's actually perfectly happy, or supposedly she says. Well, I don't know if that's actually true
Yeah.
or not. I see the thing is, because I don't know how their mind operates. I think like they can go a while and just not worry about it, right? Okay, you know what I'm saying?
But
Whereas guy,
everybody, in the Mexican culture,
it,
what they say is like everybody needs a good shaking once in a
once
while.
in a while, right, right. But I'm like, are the like, what's the like kind of avatar, the scenario that you see where when you're coaching or doing therapy, where a couple might be suited for, they're in the position at that moment for a co-wife.
I've had similar situations come up multiple times where the man is very successful, and the wife is, in a stage in her life where she's, not making herself available to her husband.
Okay.
And she's also, I've had at least a handful of situations like this where she wants to be very controlling of the husband. She wants to tell him how to dress, what to eat, when to go out the door, when to come in the door, because there's this deficit within her. And that is an example of when a man has to rise up, because the thing is, a man doesn't need his wife's permission to have a second wife. So,
A lot of people though, you're going to trigger a lot of people. That's the facts,
but it's
but
true.
it's true.
It's true. And actually, a man, as long as he can afford it, and as long as he can open a home for another wife, he doesn't even have to let the first wife know about it. Of course, you want her to know about it, because
Yeah.
if they have, but the man is the one that in society for I don't know how many years, centuries, he hasn't been elevated to his level of, what you say, sultanhood, right?
Yeah, right.
A man needs to be at that level if a woman wants to be brought up to that level.
Right, right. Absolutely. And then how do you deal with the legal aspect of it? Because according to American law, the way I've seen people do it is that they just do the Islamic nikah,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also like the concern seems to be that they really have no legal rights
So
under the
that's
law.
when something needs to be established. That's where our mosques, our masjids,
Right.
are truly, doing a huge disservice. There needs to be infrastructure set up, at least within our mosques. There needs to be infrastructure set up, within our organizations. We're really good at raising funds, which is important for charity, which is really important. But we have to have that same, passion for the aspects that are essential as well, for the livelihood, of our families, for the livelihood of our men, for the livelihood of our women, for the livelihood of our children, right?
Sure. But
And
I guess like,
we're not
but
doing that.
but my question is really like, so that seems like in the future, if you're recommending this to people now, like how would they work? Do you work up a separate legal contract?
And this is what the number one thing that has to be done. It has to be as a written legal contract.
As far as
And
like, yeah.
everything and we, in the Quran, it tells us to not have any any type of deal. And that's what a marriage is. It's a deal, right? It is a business deal. It's a business transaction. To not follow through with any transaction without a written contract.
Right. So it would,
we have to be people of integrity.
right. But a contract for the second or third wife wouldn't be a marriage contract by law. It would have to be a legal contract that just for some kind of transfer of ownership of assets and things of that sort, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know. Which can be done. I mean, it is being done already.
Okay, so there are people who are okay.
There are people that are already doing it. So we need to talk about it to, set up the framework for nobody to be taken advantage of, and for the rights to be given, right?
Sure.
And that's something that our ummah is responsible for, right? Each community is responsible for. We know that things can change in the future because men are getting married to men, women are getting married to women.
Pretty soon it'll be animals. I told somebody. I actually believe that. Like what's stopping them? But like, so
Allah protect us.
the last scenario, like I've actually heard there's a group of like women out there, like typically career women who like focus on their career early on. Now they're like mid-30s, never been married, who are actually like very open about being second wives. Now again, I've heard about this theoretically. I've heard they exist, but like because that could be a solution as well. Because financially speaking, like we both laugh in our, like we talked about in the beginning of the show, that both husband and wife are working because of the living expenses in the United States, right? Mm-hmm. So you add another person to it, that's more expenses, and that can be, I guess, mitigated. So, because again, that's thinking out loud. I know that's the hang up, because I've had some friends talk about polygamy, and I'm like, how are you going to afford it, right?
Well, then that's when you have to have that faith. We're people of faith,
right?
How many people postpone having children because they can't afford it, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us, when you are given that blessing of children, you will be provided for. When you have the right intention of having a second marriage, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to provide you. One of the brothers that I know that has multiple wives, with his wife, with his wives, with his children, they've created this generational wealth with real estate. The opportunities are there. The opportunities are there. We are, people of innovation. When the solution is there. The resources are there. It's just about the trust, that faith component.
Right. Sure. All right, Estela, thank you for the conversation tonight. Where can people find out more about you and and the work you're doing? If they want to sign up, I'm sure a lot of guys now are going to be hearing this podcast who want second wives and are going to be like blowing up your phone. So how can people reach out to you if they want your services or any of the work you're doing? I understand you also do a show in the UK called Let's Talk About Sex.
Yes. We've had 2 seasons. I was invited after a couple of interviews that I did with a sister. I was invited to host the show on British Muslim TV. Inshallah, we're going to be starting the 3rd season in September. So we're still figuring out when the start date is. Usually we do about 6 episodes per season. So inshallah, we've already got 2 seasons out there. So if you go into their YouTube channel, or if you go into their Facebook page, you'll be able to find the episodes. So the best ways to get a hold of me are look for me, in Instagram and send me a private message, or look for me in Facebook and send me a private message. Or, my full name, Estela Rodriguez.Jebril at gmail.com. You can send me an email. I hope that, you will continue, this conversation. I would love to continue this conversation. segue into different areas, inshallah. It's been such an honor being here. Thank you so much for not throwing my email into the trash.
Well, absolutely. Well, it was a pleasure having you, and I think it was like I definitely there are some questions in my head as we're wrapping this up. I'm like, I didn't ask this, I didn't ask this, I didn't ask this, but we can do it some other time, for sure. For listeners out there, you can subscribe to this podcast on YouTube at Sultans and Sneakers. I'm also available in all the audio apps: Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, Spotify. You can email me like Estela did at info@sultansandsneakers.com if you have a guest recommendation, or if you're listening to the show and you want to come on and feel like you have an interesting take to share. I'm on Instagram at Sultans and Sneakers, on Twitter, SULTANSNSNKRS, just the character limitation. And finally, if you're enjoying the content and you want to support, you can do so at patreon.com/Sultans and Sneakers. For my special guest, Estela Rodriguez-Jebril, I'm your host, Mahin the Podcaster, signing off.